A lot of people consider there to be archetypes or definitive groups of film fans and how they engage with movies. So in this video, I'm going to be explaining what I consider to be the types. The first type is the normie. This is pretty much your standard movie viewer. They watch whatever's out in their local theaters, and they don't really critically watch movies. Even the ones they really like, they don't really have much to say. If it's an action movie, they'll say they like the action. If it's romantic, they'll say they like the romance. Pretty standard analysis, or like shallow analysis. Their favorites are most likely whatever movies they grew up on or watch an important time in their life. Their favorites will typically be big blockbusters like Star Wars or Marvel or Disney. They love quirky one-liners, and a lot of the time they love when a movie doesn't take itself seriously and is kind of self-aware. They put zero conscious thought into how anything is shot or lit. This is why most movies and TV today kind of look, flat in that regard. They don't know any of the rules of framing or light. They do consider plot and writing kind of important, but the factor I feel like they use most to assess the quality of the movie is acting. Think of all the famous bad movies that, the average person says is bad. They almost always have horrible acting. Because it's pretty intuitive for anyone to acknowledge when acting is bad. Acting in its base form is just pretending. It's pretty easy to tell when someone is doing a bad job of it. I know it might seem like I'm pretty critical or even hate this type of film fan, but I don't. Not everyone has to be hardcore into movies. It's perfectly fine to be casual. But I do have more beef with studios and people who make movies kind of just exclusively to cater to this audience. The next archetype is the film bro. This and the next type are kind of like the tier directly above normie. They start to care more about just acting or basic visuals of film. They kind of consider cinematography and lighting and themes to be as important as acting and other, the action and plot and stuff. They start to have favorite directors, which of course the film bros, it's typically Scorsese, Tarantino, David Fincher, of course Nolan. The movies they love are Pulp Fiction, Taxi Driver, Fight Club, American Psycho, Oppenheimer, you know the deal. All their films have a kind of edgy, masculine vibe to them, hence the term film bro. The majority of this type is guys, but obviously girls can be in it too. This type loves to critically talk about which parts of movies they like, all the details and the shot and what it's paying homage to and other stuff. Another key aspect of these movies is the importance of story being character-driven and focused. Well, most normie movies, especially Marvel, have the characters take a backseat. There's like huge entourages of them. They're interchangeable. Movies this archetype likes have main characters at the forefront. Taxi Driver is nothing without Travis Bickle. This archetype is also notorious for being online and kind of annoying, but almost every dude and maybe girl who's a fan of movies was definitely this archetype at one point in time. Next we got the quirky film enjoyer. Similar to the film bro, this type also starts to value cinematography, lighting, and themes as much as acting. But while the film bro likes the kind of masculine, brooding, edgy movies, these people like kind of feminine, quirky style of film. Once again, I'm not speaking in absolutes here. All right, I'm just speaking kind of generally, and one's not better than the other. Directors of this style are Wes Anderson, Yorgos, Greta Gerwig, and the examples of these movies are Grand Budapest Hotel and Poor Things. Just like film bro movies, this type enjoys movies that are more character-driven. For example, Emma Stone in Poor Things. You might be thinking what I mean by quirky. And I mean the kind of purposefully awkward acting, specific exaggerated color palettes, the maximalistic production design, and the silly campy tone. But unlike in a lot of movies that are silly or absurdist, I feel like these types of movies have a much more sincere tone to them rather than it being self-deprecating. The next archetype is the baby film lover. Alright, so this category is fairly niche, but I feel like it's prominent enough on places where discourse happens on the internet that I have to include it. These people mostly like movies intended for kids, which, isn't a problem. These people often only consume this genre, and it leads to them viewing what movies are as an art form from this lens. They're extremely unacademic with their language, which, in case you can't tell, I actually think this is a good thing. Or I fucking love this, alright? One thing I can't stand about them is they can't handle morally gray characters or movies where a bad guy wins in the end. Because, in kids' movies that never happens, and they view, moral lessons as just being, good guy wins, basically. Another major factor that plays into whether this group likes a movie or not is the visuals. That's not a bad thing, and it's mostly due to them, mostly liking animation. Overall, even though these people are annoying, they do get kind of too much flack online than they deserve. The next archetype is the boomer. Alright, this group is pretty much your typical film studies teacher or film professor. They love the oldies. Right? They're obsessed with Casablanca, Singing in the Rain, pretty much any Hitchcock film. They'll never shut the fuck up about blocking, master close-up shots. They love traditional storytelling with distinct acts. They know all the fun facts about old movie stars and westerns and dry comedies. It's a typical boomer who loves film shit. They're pretty dogmatic and oftentimes are against experimentation. But unlike normies and film bros, they put cinematography and lighting, color, and all these aspects above most other aspects of film. They can excuse a cheesy plot if the other aspects are good. Their dogma might be annoying, but I think it's preferable to most normie slop, to be honest. Even if most of the movies will put you to sleep. The next archetype is the technical analyst, I guess you could say. These people take technicality to the max, alright? They pretty much only care about the technical aspects of movies. Whether it be how high quality the camera or film is, whether it's an IMAX or laser. They care about the audio design, the special effects. These people love Avatar, Oppenheimer, the Dune movies. These people could give a rat's ass if a movie's plot sucks, or if the acting is terrible, or if the characters are boring. They don't care about that shit. Their favorite types of shots are ones that are physically impressive or hard to pull off, like a dolly shot or shots where the camera is moving. And they love one take. They view movies more as technical feats than they do as art. The next archetype is people who love, experimental and surrealist movies. This type is pretty much the opposite of the boomer in the sense where they hate all the dogmatic attitudes people apply to movies. However, like the boomer, this type loves utilizing cinematography or other unconventional means of storytelling. Whether it be found footage or conveying important information using only shots or lights, this type loves when stuff is not directly told to the audience, and the overall story of the film is left ambiguous. Themes and symbolism are also extremely important. Many experimental films are not literal, so the plot doesn't always have to make direct, physical sense. Some directors they like are David Lynch or Harmony Korine. They also love surrealist, dreamlike imagery, and most famously in Eraserhead or movies like Gummo. The next archetype I'm going to talk about is the adrenaline junkie. Alright, if the technical type sees movies as more of a technological feat than an art form, adrenaline junkies see movies as more of a game or roller coaster or experience. These are the people who only go to theaters for horror movies to be jump scared and scream and have their emotions fucked with. Now, it's mostly action and horror fan. This obviously isn't always a bad thing. Some movies I feel like really exemplify this well is Mad Max Fury Road and Top Gun Maverick. Even Avatar falls into this. And the bad versions are basically, movies like The Nun and other Blumhouse slop. Obviously, this audience considers action, kind of the movements in the movie, maybe even sound design over things like cinematography, and they probably consider plot and writing to be at the bottom. The next archetype is the plot stalls, alright? Switching up from the previous types, this one considers writing and storytelling above all else, alright? That's not to say they don't consider things like cinematography and acting, but it's to be relatively minor to the plot and character arcs. Good movie equals good plot and vice versa. They consider movies to be a sort of delivery vehicle of a story rather than a more holistic art form. These people are also typically huge sci-fi and comic book fans. Their favorite movies are typically Lord of the Rings, the original Star Wars, Terminator, etc. They consider modern movies to be pretty ass consider grading movies to be often sort of objective. This type is really inspired by people like EFAP. Last archetype I'm going to talk about today is the disturbing lovers. All right, this type wants movies to push them to their fucking limits, which just the most offensive, disturbing shit you've ever seen. Depictions of brutal murder, rape, just the unthinkable. This might seem niche. This type can enjoy something as low level as Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and then obviously growing more, you can get to something like Sallow. They can have substance like Come and See or Mysterious Skin, or something as relatively meaningless as Human Centipede or Terrifier. They want to be kept up with disturbing imagery all night. This group is pretty diverse. They can favor cinematography or plot or vice versa, or consider them equal. Even the demographics are pretty diverse. It could be teenage girls or 50-year-old men. Those are what I consider to be the 10 main archetypes of film fans. It's not definitive, it's just my kind of opinion or interpretation. Let me know if you agree or if you think I missed any or was wrong. New videos soon. Make sure to like and subscribe.